right, welcome back everybody. If this is your first time to the channel, welcome to Notes to Fret, where we are all about turning theory into riffs. And in this week's video, we are going to be going over Dorian and why use Dorian as opposed to, right, the regular Aeolian minor. So let's jump right in. First, here we're looking at our modes. Once again, at the top, we have our major modes. At the bottom, we have our minor modes, right? So because our modes really start to come into their own when we start talking about their chords and what their chords sound like uniquely together, we're going to bring back in the diminished, right? Because diminished play a part in modes. Now, here, we're just going to be focusing in on kind of the equivalent that we looked at last week, which was Lydian, which was our major mode that had a raised fourth, which gave us that F sharp for C Lydian. This week, when we're looking at the minor mode, in this case Dorian, right, we're going to be looking at A Dorian as opposed to A minor, right, A Aeolian. And you can see too that it has the sharpened, or the F sharp in this case it's sharpened sixth, right? But here, this raised sixth or this sharpened sixth is really what we're going to be focusing in on as we're looking at Dorian this week. So with that being said, let's go ahead and start taking a look at what some of the differences are between A minor, A Aeolian, and A Dorian, right? When we look at it like this, we have the same exact structure, right? The same notes. So far, so good. Now, if we look down towards the bottom in the table, now we're going to be kind of looking at our chords. So therefore, we're going to bring in the diminished, right? Because the diminished is a chord. You'll notice that nothing has changed in the Dorian scale in the middle. And now we need to go ahead and raise that sixth, right? That gives us a raised sixth in the chords as well as that actual raised sixth degree in the Dorian mode, right? In the scale, right? So taking a look at this, when we are really wanting to understand Dorian, what the mode is really all about versus the minor mode, we have to pay attention to how the scale translates into giving us different chords, right? So when we look at the A minor scale, right? Every guitarist on the planet knows this pattern. Here it is, A minor. Now, when we talk about going to Dorian, we need to raise the sixth, right? Or really that F becomes F sharp. And as we just kind of look at the difference, and this is similar to what we did last week in the Lydian mode. But here we're saying, okay, well, I move this note up. Okay, it gives me an F sharp. How does that really matter? But again, we need to pay attention to the difference in the chord quality as well as the scale, right? The scale, the difference in that F sharp is going to really help us with our melodies. But it has impact on the chords, right? Which is going to really distinguish our harmonies. And if we look at the chords, the second in Aeolian is diminished. In Dorian, it's just a straight minor. In Aeolian, the fourth is a minor. In Dorian, it's a major. That's pretty big. And then when we look at the sixth, in Aeolian, it's major, and in Dorian, it's a diminished chord, right? So those are things we definitely need to pay attention to. Now here, if we just take a really quick look by way of comparison, right? We've got A minor at the top, and down at the bottom, we've got E minor. Well, why am I bringing up E minor, right? We're talking about A minor and A Dorian, and all of a sudden I just randomly throw in E minor. Why? Well, if we look at the sixth in A minor, which is an F, and we look at the second in E minor, which is also an F, almost an F really, so close, but not really, because it's a F sharp. Okay, now if we throw in the chord qualities as well, we can see that in A minor at the top, we have an F major. But when we throw in the chord qualities down at the bottom, you'll notice that we have an F sharp diminished, right? If we look at the top, we've got an F. If we look down at E minor at the bottom, we've got an F sharp. but the chord quality is diminished, right? So therefore, E minor has an F sharp diminished. So keep that in mind, right? Where do we see this F sharp diminished? We see it in another place as well. Now, when we're actually comparing A minor, right, at the top to a Dorian down at the bottom, you can see that the only real difference between the A minor at the top and the A Dorian down at the bottom is really, once again, we've got an F versus an F sharp. And it's the ordering of this half step, whole step, becoming a whole step, half step, right? So here, what's the impact of that? Well, the impact is we definitely have an F in A minor, but an F sharp in A Dorian. Okay, fair enough. Now let's bring in the chord qualities. We still have F major, right? It's still A minor at the top. But when we bring in the chord qualities for our Dorian, our sixth is now an F sharp diminished. Now, where else did we see an F sharp diminished? Well, we saw it in E minor. And so as we're paying attention to this, the sharpened chord down here, we really need to kind of fundamentally understand really what that's giving us, right? Not just, the second from diminished in A minor to minor at the bottom, our fourth, which is minor at the top, D minor, D major at the bottom, and then F major at the top for our sixth, and F sharp diminished for our sixth down at the bottom. So what I want to bring up here really quick is, as I refer to kind of that F sharp diminished wanting to come back to its natural minor, I'm not referring to the natural minor scale here, right? If you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. We haven't covered it. Don't worry about it. If you do know what it is, realize that that is not what I'm talking about here when I say it comes back to its natural minor. We'll look at the circle of fifths here in a second. When our ear hears F sharp diminished, it naturally wants to kind of go into that key of E minor. And that's what I'm referring to when I'm pointing that out. Additionally here, this week, when we talk about our tonic, right, the first note in the scale and our dominant, right, it's very easy to go back and forth. We're talking about the Dorian mode this week. So, the first to the fifth, I'm going to refer to it very much as a Dorian thing, just because that's what we're focusing on this week. It happens in Lydian as well. Wanted to point that out. But here, I just want to make certain that we're focusing in on Dorian. So with that being said, it's going to make a little bit more sense about what I'm talking about as we look at the scale of fifths, or the circle of fifths. Now, at the top, we have in this case, our A minor key. And we know that A minor has a B diminished, right? And when we look at our neighboring key, which is E minor, well, it's very close. These keys, we've talked about how closely related they are. There's a lot of overlap, so the ear can get a little confused. Now, when we look at E minor in particular, it has that F sharp, but more importantly, it has that F sharp diminished, right? We have to pay attention to this. So let's go ahead and kind of focus in on our circle of fifths for a minute. And here, once again, we talk about when we hear that F sharp diminished, it naturally wants to go back to E minor. But we now have to say, I know you've heard F sharp diminished, but we need to keep you in A minor, right? And again, the E minor is the dominant, so we got to pay attention to that. We'll talk more about that here in a moment when we listen to the actual sound of Dorian. So we just got to keep this in mind and make sure that our listeners are always coming back to A minor. And again here, just as before in our Lydian mode, we want to pay attention to those outliers, right? That's really going to help us with our music to understand Dorian a little bit better. And that's what we're going to go ahead and hop into now. We're actually going to go ahead and just spend some time listening to Dorian to understand it a little bit better. All right, so what we're doing this week, obviously we are looking at Dorian, And what we're going to do is we're going to start off with some music just like we did last time, right? So what was that all about? When we are now trying to establish our Dorian sound, in this case, A Dorian, we need to make certain that the listener's ear goes from, right, in this case, our raised sixth, back to our tonic to establish the actual mode. However, what the ear wants to do is go back to its natural minor. Just like last week, we were constantly competing, right? When we had the F sharp, it always wanted to go back to G major. However, we needed to establish that the F sharp always wanted to go back to C major. This week is no different, except for the fact that we are still continuing to look at F sharp, but once the ear establishes that F sharp is what we're going after for that flavor, and it establishes that, hey, I'm in a minor mode, I have F sharp in a minor mode, it wants, what it's going to want to do is come back to that minor, the appropriate minor, in this case E minor. However, what we need to establish right off the bat is that A minor is where their ear is going to want to come back to. So we're going to have to work around a couple things in the minor scale, and there's a few unique challenges that the minor scales, in this case Dorian, present that the major scales last week, Lydian, we didn't really run into, but here we're definitely going to have to take into account. But before I do that, what I want to do is just talk about or kind of establish our initial chord progression, so we can kind of use that. And this week, just like last, I'm going to use a 1, 2, 3, 5. Then I'm going to follow that up with the seventh, and I'm not only going to use the seventh degree of the scale, but I'm also going to add in the seventh of the chord. And we'll talk about that in a second. So let's first go ahead and listen to this so we can kind of start to understand a little bit more about what we're talking about, right? Again, 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, back to the tonic, right? In this case, A minor is our tonic. So what did I do there? Well, we definitely had the tonic, followed by the second, which in this case is B minor rather than B diminished, because we have that F sharp, which is a perfect fifth, rather than the F, which is a diminished fifth, right? So we go from our first to our second, which is now minor, to our third, which, okay, it's just C major, to our fifth, which is E minor, to our seventh, and we also use, which in this case our seventh is our G major, but we add in that F sharp as well, back to our A. And again, with G major, which is our seventh degree of the scale, the reason I wanted to use the seventh chord, because it gives me an opportunity to bring in that F sharp and we go from, instead of a G dominant seventh, we have a G major seventh, right? Because we raised that seventh, in this case the F to F sharp. Back to our tonic. So I'm just looking for opportunities to bring in that F sharp wherever I can. Now, one of the things that is going to be a little bit unique this week is with the Dorian mode, which is minor. For so much of our chord progressions, we've always said that if you want to come back to the tonic, a great way to do that is to go from the dominant, in this case the seventh, or I'm sorry, the fifth, which in this case is E. Go from the fifth back to the tonic. Right? Sounds really good. That's the, you're looking at 1, 5, 1. Now here's the issue this week when we're talking about the Dorian mode, because it's minor. Our tonic is competing, right? We got A minor, and it's competing with this E minor because they're so close, right? So close, and we looked at that in the circle of fifths. So if my competition for my tonic is my dominant, and I, just kind of generically say, oh, well, always go from the dominant back to the tonic, right? Let's see what that sounds like. Not bad. Let's say I do that over and over. First, it's going to sound boring after a while, but let's say I do this over and over. The problem here is I've definitely used the dominant the way I should, right? Dominant, back to tonic. However, in doing this little combo thing, I've lost the listener's ear for what the tonic actually is. All I've done is I said A, which is what I want to use for Dorian, and then I go, hey, this is my neighboring minor, right? This is my competition. What I'm competing for to make certain that your ear comes back to my A minor, the biggest competitor that I have is E minor. It's my dominant. And so now by going back and forth, I've lost you. The listeners has no clue. So now all of a sudden what we say is the chord that should be the most powerful to get me back to my tonic is the one that I'm almost competing with the most. So all of a sudden, minor, certainly Dorian mode, has this real like, whoa, like how do I get back home? What starts to make sense? And there's a couple things. What I want to do to kind of establish this conversation a little bit more is I want to play something that will ultimately resolve very, very nicely to our E, right? So let's take a listen to this really quick. Right, that just sounds good. Now, would I want to eliminate that from my music because I want to avoid E minor? Well, no. What happens within the Dorian mode is there's going to be a lot of things that sound really good coming back to E minor. You wouldn't want to rob your music of that because it sounds fantastic. And so let's isolate that a little bit. Sounds great. Now here's the thing about it, is because it sounds so good, that resolved. That was the resolution. I came back to E minor. I'm home. We just lost Dorian altogether because this is Dorian. But we did something that sounds so nice. And if you add any flavor to that, it sounds even better. Definitely, I'm coming back. So if I recognize that in Dorian, one of my biggest competitors, sorry, one of my biggest competitors from my tonic is my dominant, right? A minor, E minor. Does that mean I take it away? Well, absolutely not. You would absolutely want to use this in your music. It sounds great. Here's the thing. What you don't want to do is linger in this E minor. If you do something that sounds great, you just went into the key of E minor and you've lost your listener. However, one of the things that I like to do to get back to A minor, which is where I want to be for A Dorian, this is where I want to be for A Dorian, here's what I'll do. Or something like that. Now you may be wondering, what exactly did you do? Well, I allowed the really nice combination that brought me back to E minor to take place. But what I did next was immediately go into a little bit of dissonance to get me back to that A minor, which I want to establish for Dorian as my home, right? So one of the things as you're saying, okay, well, dominant, back to tonic, right? Sounds great. And it's oftentimes what, beginning groups will start to do is they'll say, okay, well, no matter what, dominant gets me back to the tonic. Yes. But if you're in modes and you're using them appropriately, you're going to lose that listener. So the best thing to do is allow that, beautiful E minor to come out, but just immediately add something. Or you don't even, you can use the fuller chords if you wanted to, right? Oops, I hit the wrong key on that one. Always get back, right? So allow that. Always get back to that. And so keep that in mind, right? As you're flowing through your Dorian modes or any of your modes, pay attention. In Dorian, it's unique because your competing note, key or chord, is your fifth. You've got the dominant and tonic competing with one another. So don't linger. Add in dissonance. And one of the things I want to point out with Dorian in particular, we have the F sharp. I may want to kind of intermingle right? So if I've got something that sounds great, coming back to E minor, I want that to use that F sharp, right? But if I need to add in some dissonance, I may hit that F as a passing chord, right? So I've got something. Again, little flavor. I won't linger on F because F sharp is my Dorian, or in this case, obviously the raised sixth. But I might, if I need it, right? If I really am, wow, I think the listener's coming back to E minor and I don't want them to, I might add in something. Confuses the ear, so this is very comfortable. All of a sudden something's very confusing. Very confusing. And so the ear's like, reestablished home. Food for thought, some of your creativity, right? And I think a lot of times with modes, you know, as guitarists we're looking for, tell me how to put them together. There's a creativity to it, right? And that's where understanding the circle of fifths and how that circle of fifths correlates to our modes really comes into play. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump back over into the slides and continue the lesson. All right, everybody. So hopefully you got a little bit of understanding with the Dorian scale from that, or the Dorian mode, a little bit more from hearing it. So here, you know, just really quick, want to kind of break down a little bit of the chord progression. I'm gonna leave the seventh out, right? But you know, we have this A minor. Now you can play this all over the place, right? Wherever you want to, wherever you're most comfortable playing it on the fretboard. But notice where your A minor has the E in it, right? It's one of the notes, right? It's the perfect fifth. So it gives you an opportunity for some of your voicings and your voice leadings when you want to kind of transition between chords, right? And why I'm bringing that up is because if you go from, you know, 3 different chords and they all have that E in them on your fretboard, right? You're doing it for some really efficient voice leadings, but every chord has E in it. Just be careful because you can establish the ear to have that E in it, right? So anyways, just wanted to kind of bring that up with you. Here, we're looking at B minor. And the important thing here is that we get that F sharp, right? That F sharp really helps us establish Dorian, which is awesome, right? And that we definitely want that, obviously. Then we have our C major. And this is kind of what I'm alluding to, right? If you went back and forth too much from A minor to C major to A minor to C major, but you had an F sharp kind of thrown in there for a little bit of flavor periodically, you'll notice that the E doesn't change. Instead, the E is consistent. And you start throwing in an F sharp wherever it is, right? You want to, you know, you're doing something fancy with your E major chord and you have F sharp in there for whatever reason. And if you keep on going from A to C, A to C, A to C, this E is going to be the consistent tone. So it's very important to understand your chords as you construct them, to understand what the tone is that's going to be consistent in there. So again, just be aware of that. You'll definitely want to change some things up. But then, you know, I just went to E minor, and I'm basically showing you on the fretboard what I did on the keyboard. But again, there's 10 billion different ways for you to play this on the fretboard. So I'm encouraging you, I'm hoping you do, go grab your guitar and try to put all this on the fretboard, because that is honestly the way that you're going to learn. But you've seen everything that I did on the fretboard from what I was just doing on the keyboard. So, you know, again, it brings you back to the exact circle of fifths. We're talking about just be careful between the A minor and E minor. And yes, anybody out there is like, oh, in Lydian from C to G, it's also the tonic to dominant. You're 100% correct. But again, this week I really wanted to focus in on the minor, and obviously in this case, the Dorian. But, keep in mind, we're looking at the circle of fifths on the right, that this is your perfect fifth, which is part of your chord. And that's what I'm talking about. You just got to kind of be careful because, here A minor screams B diminished with E minor as the dominant, right? That's kind of the uniqueness of it. Now, the only thing that I do want to point out just a little bit with this, when we're looking at the circle of fifths and we're looking at the scale, we have our tonic, we have our octave, all well and good, and we have our dominant. And we talked about this. We obviously have our subdominant, right? And our subdominant is what pulls us away from our tonic. And here, right, you're going to just need to be paying attention to it a little bit. We're going to talk about the subdominant much more in some of the other modes. So for this week, just concentrate on the dominant, kind of bringing you back. Now, the only other thing with this, right, we talked about the dominant quite a bit, and that obviously being the E. But as we talk about coming into the tonic, there's other ways to come back to it, right? And we spoke about something called leading tones. And I haven't gotten deep into leading tones if you've missed some of those videos, so don't worry about it too much. But what I do want to point out with minors, if you notice the distance from G to A, and I'm looking over at the seventh to the octave, that's a whole step. Whereas in majors, because you have the B to C as example and C major, that's a half step. That half step is a leading tone. So in major modes, you have a leading tone, which is just a half step from the seventh to the octave. And that's a very, very powerful resolution back to the tonic that we can use. It's fantastic. In minors, we have a whole step, right? From G to A in this example. And that doesn't change with any of the minor modes. So that pull back from the seventh to the octave or the seventh to the tonic, however you want to look at it, it's not quite as strong in minors. So again, that's one of the areas you need to just be aware of, that in minors, getting back to the tonic is very much like, hey, let me use the dominant back to the tonic, because that's very, very powerful. The alternative, a lot of times, is to say, let me go from the seventh back to the tonic. Well, in minors, that's not as powerful. So we tend to go, hey, the dominant to the tonic, that's my powerful thing, because my seventh is a little bit weaker because it's a whole step. So it's one of those warnings you just got to kind of be careful of. If you're not understanding what I'm talking about from the seventh to the octave being a whole step, I'll leave a link down in the description where I do talk a little bit about leading tones, but leading tones really is going to be something that we bring up later. But if you have watched the videos on the past with some of this stuff, you'll know what I'm talking about. So with that being said, the other thing that I did bring in was the G major seventh, right? And if we look at the G major, right, we from the tonic to the third, we have a major third, which is fine. Then from the tonic to the fifth, it's a perfect fifth, so therefore we have a major chord. And then bringing in that F sharp, I now have a major third, right? And so again, it just gave me an opportunity to really bring in that F sharp. And that's really the only reason that I did it, was looked for all the opportunities that I could subtly bring in F sharp, but really establish that I wanted to come back into A, in this case, A Dorian being my tonic. So with that, this week, we were comparing the Dorian and the Aeolian. If this table is, what you want to look at, this is kind of the more formal table. Again, this thing gives me a headache, but I do want to put it out there in case anybody hears it, or if this is your preferred mode of learning the modes. I wanted to make sure that the information was out there, but I don't want to linger on it. So with that being said, in conclusion, this week, right, we obviously reviewed the Dorian scale, Dorian mode. You probably hear it both ways quite often, but regardless, understanding and applying the mode, right, where we look for those F sharps, where to be careful on the fretboard. And we also obviously heard the sound of it. Right? And the sound is really to kind of get your ear established to understanding some of the dissonant sounds, some of the uncomfortable sounds, and how we can make those sounds come back to something more comfortable, in this case, A minor. And then understanding the potential conflict, right? How do we look at the circle of fifths in combination with our scales to understand where to be careful, where to explore, and how to, even if we do explore, how not to lose the listener's ear, right? And always be able to kind of bring them back to our desired mode. So with all of that being said, a little bit of a long video this week again, but it happens when the audio gets combined. So if you're getting something out of these videos, would really love to get a thumbs up from you. Keep the comments coming. Love replying to everybody. And again, huge help to the channel. It's free. I don't charge you anything. YouTube doesn't charge you anything. Smash that subscribe. And with that being said, we will see you in the next video where we will go over the next major mode, which is Lydian. So until then, take care, everybody.